And welcome to this really beautiful, stunning space offered to us through the generosity of Georgetown Visitation. And at the very beginning of this evening, I just want to, of this part of the evening, I should say, that on behalf of all of us here, I just want to express our heartfelt thanks to Mother Mary Berkmanshanen and the community of Georgetown Visitation Monastery, the headmaster of the school, Mr. Dan Kearns, and the staff. We're so very grateful to you for your hospitality. Thank you so much. Thank you. You know, as you look around this room, you see men and women, young and old and middle-aged. You see religious men and women. You see priests and even a cardinal. And being here together this evening is really a visible sign of how we are here for one another and for the world. We're here to support one another, to learn from one another, to be church together, to become together missionary disciples, to go out and to share the good news with everyone. During the last nearly 33 years, we at the Lay Center have experienced the beauty of intergenerational friendships. Though the majority of our residential community consists of women and men in their 20s and early 30s, we've always had a constellation of friends of diverse age groups and vocations as part of the wider family. And this has been a real blessing. This experience of intergenerational friendship brings me to the theme of this evening's session. You will be my witnesses, a mentoring church. The topic was chosen in light of the 2018 Synod that will happen in October on young people, the faith, and vocational discernment. And we've invited Cardinal Tobin to share his vision and the importance of an intergenerational church to which young people are welcome, befriended, and accompanied in faith by members of the local parishes across generations. How can intergenerational friendships in faith benefit young people? And how can the church, especially in the United States, develop a mentoring culture? Well, these are some of the questions we want to look at this evening. So after Cardinal Tobin gives a few opening remarks, Dr. Susan Timoney will moderate a dialogue, a question and answer session that will include the voices also of young adults. So allow me to say just a brief word about the Cardinal and about Dr. Timoney. So Cardinal Joseph Joe Tobin hails from Detroit, as we already heard at Vespers. He entered the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer, more commonly known as the Redemptorist, and was ordained a priest in 1978. And after several years of ministry here in the United States, he served as Superior General of his congregation for 12 years. And that's where I first met him, when he was in Rome. He used to come to the Lay Center for Mass. Who would have thunk it that here he is now? He was ordained a bishop in 2010 and served at the Vatican Curia as a secretary for the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Lives and Societies of Apostolic Life. And in 2012, he was named Archbishop of Indianapolis, and then, as you all know, Archbishop of Newark 5 years later. And happily, he was elevated to the College of Cardinals in 2016. And so he'll be joined this evening by Dr. Susan Timoney, who's secretary for pastoral ministry and social concerns at the Archdiocese of Washington. And Dr. Timoney coordinates evangelization of initiatives and pastoral planning for the archdiocesan parishes. She oversees the work of the Office of Family Life, the Office of Youth Adult Ministry, and the Office of Hispanic Catholics. And Dr. Timoney earned her STD at the Angelicum in Rome, where she focused on theology and Christian spirituality. And of course, the best part is she lived at the Lay Center. And she worked with me at the Lay Center for a number of years, and I miss her a lot. And I'm very grateful to her that she's also a board member here and continues this long relationship with the Lay Center. So now I turn it over to Cardinal Tobin, and we eagerly look forward to your words.
Thank you, Donna. Full disclosure, I met Donna along with about 200 other, I think Father Mark Francis was there, when she gave an incredible presentation on the notion of dialogue in Ecclesiam Suam. Full disclosure, if I gave you $1 for every time I've cited your talk, you'd be one rich lady. The other great honor of my life, besides citing Donna, was to convey a title that she was awarded, which is as a dame, a pontifical, is it the dame of?
St. Gregory the Great.
St. Gregory the Great. And among her many privileges is to ride her horse into the St. Peter's, yes.
A white horse.
A white horse, okay. Right. So keep following Catholic News Service. You know? Did you hear the story about the 3 prisoners who are to be executed during the Reign of Terror on the Place de Concorde? And the first to be led to the guillotine was a German. He was placed under the blade, and the blade was dropped, and it stopped inches from his neck. And the people on the place said, "Miracle, miracle, let him go, let him go." The second was an Italian, and the same thing happened. The third was an American. And as he was being led to the guillotine, he looked up and he said, "You know, if you tighten the bolts at the top of this thing, it would work." Well, that's part of our American genius. We like to get things to work. And it sometimes can be our liability, because we like to do it either so we can publish it in Reader's Digest or in 10 Easy Steps. This is going to sound really self-serving, and it is. My task tonight is not to talk about mentoring or accompaniment in 10 Easy Steps. I'd like to talk about the new vocabulary that Pope Francis has given to pastoral ministry. Watchwords such as mercy, dialogue, encounter, accompaniment, discernment, field hospital, and periphery now resonate throughout the church, and have become a signature expressions of Francis's Petrine ministry. So what I hope today to do this evening is to look at one of those words that I think captures mentoring, but Francis doesn't use mentoring. It's accompaniment. And to see whether his way of living it and demonstrating it, as well as the preparation document for this year's synod, might give you some ideas on how you can breach or help breach the ever-widening gap between the church and young people. Now, I could spend all evening talking about the reasons for that gap and the characteristics of the gap. The research of people like Professor Christian Smith at Notre Dame has demonstrated fairly convincingly that the growing tide of unbelief in the United States is driven by the youngest cohort. they're turning away. And interestingly enough, or alarmingly enough, young women are turning away faster than men. I don't believe that any of you doubt that this disconnect exists. Instead, I'd like to illustrate what accompaniment looks like from the perspective of Francis and see whether this might illuminate new possibilities for you who are concerned with transmitting the faith to the next generation. So I begin with a visit that Francis made in 2016. I think it was in April. He went to the Greek island of Lesbos to visit some enormous refugee camps there. He was accompanied by a Greek Orthodox bishop, and I believe there was an imam along with him as well. On his return flight, he had 12 more passengers because he brought a couple of families and with 6 children in between them. It was very criticized for it. But he suggests that any solution to Europe's refugee crisis begins with personal acts. So Pope Francis didn't just visit a refugee camp, didn't just bless the people there, didn't have lunch with them, didn't just extol their endurance in tough circumstances. No, he arranged to accompany them back to Rome and help them make new lives there. And I'm told he continues to meet with them now that they're settled. Seen that way, I think Pope Francis's trip to Lesbos and the decisions he made there could be a gloss on the apostolic exhortation for the care for families, and especially young people. In his actions, Pope Francis affirmed this is how the church should address the pastoral challenge, by accompanying young people on their journey of faith. Let's think a little bit more about that week. On April 8th, 2016, the Vatican released the Apostolic Exhortation, a result of 2 synods on the family. I know maybe you've heard of it. It's called Amoris Laetitia. A week later, on April 15th, Pope Francis went to Lesbos and returned with the 12. But on his way out of Rome that morning, he exchanged greetings with the Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, who had come to the Casa Santa Marta, where the Holy Father lives, the day before to speak at a Vatican conference. Now, consideration of those 8 days and those 3 events suggests how fully the Pope's conviction that the Church should accompany people on their journeys of faith. It has made people of all sorts wish to accompany him, and it points to a crucial effort of this phenomena for Americans. Namely, at that moment in the presidential campaign, in which the role of religion was seen to be generally diminished, the key religious figure was the Pope, of all people. It's that Pope Francis has shown us again and again what it means for Catholics and the Church to accompany others. You meet people where they are. You presume the good in them and hope that they will presume the good in you. You have a conversation. You open your heart and mind. You prepare to learn something from them. You go where they are going, if only for a little while, trusting that something good will come of it. You keep your wits about you, but you don't let scruples rule you. But accompanying young people has a deeper character than simply walking beside them. This emerges in the preliminary document for this year's synod. The preparatory document for the Synod of Bishops explains, one who accompanies others has to realize that each person's situation before God and their life in grace are mysteries, which no one can fully know from without. It's true that the gospel tells us to correct others and to help them grow on the basis of a recognition of the wrongness of their lives, but without making judgments about them and culpability. Interesting. Recent studies have shown the biggest barrier for young people in the church is the feeling that they're being judged. In his programmatic letter, The Joy of the Gospel, Francis goes on to explain, genuine spiritual accompaniment always begins and flourishes in the context of service to the mission of evangelization. And then he points for our consideration to a couple of young people. Paul's relationship with Timothy and Titus provide an example of this accompaniment and formation, which takes place in the midst of apostolic activity, entrusting them with the mission of remaining in each city to put in order what remains to be done. Paul also gives them rules for their personal lives and their pastoral activity. This is clearly distinct from every kind of intrusive accompaniment or isolated self-realization. A key principle for us is that missionary disciples accompany missionary disciples. Now, accompaniment of a young person can take on features of what classically is known in Christian spirituality as discernment. The preparatory document for the Synod, gives three basic beliefs that underline the process of discernment and how someone can help a young person in this necessary spiritual path. These beliefs are ingrained in every human being's experience, understood in the light of faith and Christian tradition. The first is that the Spirit of God works in the heart of every man and woman through feelings and desires that are bound to ideas, images, and plans. Listening carefully, the human being has the possibility to interpret these signals. The second belief is that the human heart, because of its weakness and sin, is normally divided because it is attracted to different and even contrary feelings. The third belief is that every way of life imposes a choice, because a person cannot remain indefinitely in an undetermined state. A person needs to adopt the instruments needed to recognize the Lord's call to the joy of love and choose to respond to it. Among these instruments, the Church's spiritual tradition emphasizes the importance of a personal accompaniment. In accompanying another person, the study of the teachings on discernment is not enough. One needs the hard, personal experience of interpreting the movements of the heart to recognize the action of the Spirit, whose voice can speak to the uniqueness of each individual. Personal accompaniment demands the constant refinement of one's sensitivity to the voice of the Spirit and leading to discovering a resource and richness in each person's individual character. It is a question of fostering a person's relationship with God and helping remove what might hinder it. Herein lies the difference between accompaniment in discerning and psychological support, which when open to transcendence oftentimes has a basic importance. The psychologist supports those in difficulties and helps them become aware of their weaknesses and their potential. Spiritual guidance reorients the person towards the Lord and prepares the ground for an encounter with Him. Jesus' encounter with the people of his time, as recorded in the Gospel, highlights certain elements which are part of the ideal profile of a person accompanying a young person in vocational discernment, namely a loving look. We see that in the call of the first disciples, especially in John. An authoritative word in the synagogue at Capernaum when Jesus described what he was about. An ability to become a neighbor, which is illustrated by the Good Samaritan. A choice to walk beside in the disciples on their way to Emmaus. And an authentic witness fearlessly going against preconceived ideas. The washing of the feet at the Last Supper. In the task of accompanying the younger generation, the church accepts her call to collaborate in the joy of young people rather than be tempted to take control of their faith. Such service is ultimately founded in prayer and in asking for the gift of the Spirit, who guides and enlightens everyone. I never say in conclusion, because someone once defined second wind as what happens when a bishop says in conclusion. Instead, I'll share a personal recollection from my misspent youth of how someone accompanied me through a very simple gesture. It was a professor of mine in my undergrad studies. And after class one day, he gave me a little book by C.S.s. Lewis. Maybe you know it. It's called Till We Have Faces. It's one of the few novels he ever wrote. And he said, take this. I think it might have something to say to you. 40 years later, I remain intrigued by the title. I've read it several times. And the title, Till We Have Faces, has always haunted me. It refers to a line in the book where the narrator asks, how can the gods meet us face to face till we have faces? Now, Lewis defended his choice of the title in a letter to a friend, explaining that a human must be speaking with its own voice, not one of its borrowed voices, expressing its actual desires, not what it imagines that it desires, being for good or ill itself, not any mask. In John's Gospel, the vocational story begins with Jesus' question. What are you looking for? And the gradualism of his conversations in that gospel with the woman at the well, with his disciples in that wonderful climax with Peter, can guide the process of spiritual accompaniment, mentoring, if you will. It's only at the end of John's gospel that Jesus says to Peter, now you follow me, because now you know who I am. What can guide your service, if you choose, in a changed landscape, is a desire to help young people discover their true face, their own voice, and reflect the face of the church, which is always reflective, the Mysterium Lunae, the mystery of the moon, shining with the light of Christ. Thank you.
Cardinal Tobin, thank you. Thank you for giving us an example of the depth and the richness of these words that Pope Francis is adding to our pastoral lexicon. In preparation for the Synod on Young People and Discernment, it was very important to Pope Francis that he hear from the young people of the church. And so dioceses around the world were asked to host listening sessions, and there's even an online survey available for young people to say what they would like to say to the Holy Father and to the bishops who will be gathered at the Synod. He asked that there be Catholics and people of other faiths. He asked that there would be young people who are connected to the church and young people maybe who feel very distant from the church. And so we thought in that spirit of inviting young people that tonight we would invite 3 young adults to be the first respondents and to open up our Q&A. And I'll have to say that these are young adults who absolutely believe that they can help turn the tide of the exodus of their peers from the church. These are young adults who have found a home in the local church and who are committed to wanting to invite others to find that home. And so I'm really happy to introduce to you Colleen Campbell. Colleen is a PhD student at Catholic University of America. She's focusing on the relationship between catechesis and the formation of Catholic identity, especially in women. She's a Notre Dame grad, was a participant in the ECHO program, which introduces young people to the life of pastoral ministry, and served as an apprentice catechetical leader in the Diocese of Galveston, Houston. Laura Doran is a graduate of the University of Maryland School of Architecture with a minor in Italian culture and language, so a lay center student at heart, we'd have to say, Laura. She works in the administrative offices of the U.S. courts as an architect, looking at the construction of major projects and renovation of court buildings. Laura lives on Capitol Hill and was for 4 years the leader of young adult ministry at St. Peter's on Capitol Hill, which is one of the most vibrant young adult ministry programs we have in the Archdiocese. Jonathan Lewis. Jonathan is the executive director of the Office of Evangelization, Young Adult Ministry, and Chaplaincies at the Archdiocese of Washington. He also is a graduate of Notre Dame and the ECHO program. And in a few weeks, Jonathan is going out on the road with Cardinal Wuerl, Cardinal O'Malley, and Bishop McElroy to break open Amoris Laetitia on college campuses across the country. Surely a tour not to be missed in the church, I think. And so Laura and Jonathan and Colleen have talked with one another about what they were hoping to hear from Cardinal Tobin, and now Cardinal Tobin, they have a few questions and a few comments to share with you. So, Colleen.
Okay. Well, first of all, can everyone hear me? Okay. Cardinal, it's such an honor to be in front of you and in this room with so many wonderful people who have done such amazing things for the church, but especially as a young woman who seeks leadership in the church, I thank you so much for your encouragement as for me as a young woman. Oh, I'm so sorry.
I really want to hear what you have to say.
Okay, great. So, Cardinal, I just have a question for you. My focus in my education at the Catholic University of America is catechetics, and so in the subject area of mentoring and young adults, what role do you see catechesis, especially maybe younger children, playing in a restructuring of the church in kind of a culture of mentoring? Yeah. Come on up.
Well, thank you. And congratulations on your work and the project you've undertaken with your doctorate. I think I'm guessing we all would agree that, catechesis has undergone a great change in emphasis since I did my MRE, back in the Stone Age. I think at the time there was a great emphasis, and perhaps a necessary emphasis, on experience. But without the reflective tools that would connect us to the Word of God and the tradition of the Church. And so people were left with a lot of experience, but maybe not the deep insight and sort of the spiritual wisdom that the reading today from Colossians talked about. So I think that young people today who are engaging in catechesis, who are going to serve as catechists, need to be connected in a real way to those sources of the church's life, but at the same time not be absent from people's experience. There's a joke they tell about. Well, I'll tell you when the punchline comes, about a guy who parachutes out of a tree into a tree. He jumps out of a plane, the wind takes him, he ends up in a tree, and he's swaying between heaven and earth, and two men come along walking down below, and they're talking very seriously. And the man yells, "Hey, you," and they look up, and he says, "Where am I?" And they talk for a while, and they come back and say, "You're in a tree." And he says, "Okay." He says, "Where's the tree?" So they talk a little bit more, and they turn back and said, "In the middle of a field." He said, "You're theologians." And he said, "Yes, how could you tell?" He said, because your answers are correct, but they don't help me. You know? And so I think the challenge in catechesis with young people is to give them answers that are true and that really help them, you know? And probably that's, you know, not simply the catechetics, but preachers, you know, as well. So thank you for the question. Good.
Maybe, Cardinal Tobin, if you stay, and I might just ask Laura to stand, that might be
Okay.
Laura.
Then I can write it down.
Yeah.
Hello. So I'm going to start first with a comment and then go into my questions. So speaking as one of the young people in the Washington, D.C. community, it is really inspiring to hear these words from Pope Francis and from you today for the desire for young people to be heard. I feel like sometimes we as young adults find ourselves kind of between family units. We're not quite children anymore, but we haven't started our own families. And so a lot of times when you're participating in church activities, you hear homilies about families and you see sacramental classes and events geared towards families. And so you often feel like you're in a holding pattern because you don't fit in that category anymore. And so my question is, for those of us who are young adults and we don't yet have the demands of our own family life, how can we best serve our parishes and communities and serve the church during this time in our lives?
Well, I think that I would guess that the people sitting here that have families and certain responsibilities would say, well, the answer is easy. You have a certain freedom now that you can use in a way that people who have made those lifelong commitments can't. So I think, but then how do you use it? Well, you know, as a religious superior and then later as a bishop, when I would meet with a priest or a brother, we talk about a lot of things, but there are two questions I always asked. Do you have a spiritual director? When did you make your last retreat? And for priests, I'm batting 1,000, that every priest that I met and listened to who was in a really deep-rooted existential crisis lacked one or both. You know? And so I think one of the things you can do, even though you have the energy and you have the freedom, is not to neglect the discernment. Because not only can you give, but the Lord is speaking to you through these experiences. And with the help of another, you can make it out, what God is asking of you. And I think it also gives, it's a great guarantee against that 20th and 21st century malady, which is called burnout. Personally, I don't think burnout is simply an accumulation of activity, or that's getting tired. Burnout is a loss of meaning. And if you're burned out, getting out of bed in the morning is really tough. I think what a spiritual guide helps us do is step back from the busyness of our life, much like if you were trying to read a newspaper that was tacked to the end of your nose. You can make out a couple words and letters, but even the effort is painful, and you never see what's really there. So I would say, yeah, use the freedom, the energy, and obviously the formation that you have, but don't neglect the discernment piece for yourself. Okay.
Jonathan.
Thank you, Eminence. Happy to be with you all and to see some of my mentors here, former professors. My question stems from my current work in administration and learning the charism of administration, for better and for worse, working in diocesan life. And it seems to me that for as much as we focus on institutional change, that in the history of the church, institutional change never leads, but often it's a spiritual renewal and a renewed spirituality that facilitates that institutional change. And so I hear a bit of sort of an incarnational spirituality of proximity and knownness that young people are looking for, and I was wondering if you could maybe expound upon a spiritual renewal maybe that we see the beginnings of taking place that might break open that culture change that's needed in the American church for mentoring.
When I was a little older than you, but not too much, I received a phone call at 5 o'clock in the morning from something that's called the General Chapter. The General Chapter is like a parliament that meets and elects the leadership in a religious order. They were meeting in Brazil in 1991, and it was the newly elected Superior General calling me at 5 o'clock in the morning in Chicago. And he said, "Tobin, Jesus wants you to share my cross for the next 6 years." And I later told him that if I wasn't so screwed up at 5 o'clock in the morning, I would have said, "Put Jesus on the phone," so I could hear from him. And I have to tell you, I went to Rome with a less than eager pace, because I was aware of all I was losing, for the sake of administration. A vibrant and challenging parish, hockey 3 nights a week, just a lot of perks, hot dogs, And I went out of my way to express my displeasure in the initial meetings of this team. And finally, this guy who said Jesus called me aside, and he said, "Tobin, you have to see what we are doing as missionary. If you don't see it as missionary, you're going to go crazy, and you're going to make me crazy too." So the first thing I would say is, there is a charism, in Paul called administration, but it's always directed to the mission. And there's a wonderful phrase in that new vocabulary that Francis has given us called pastoral conversion. And we used to talk about when Mark and I were wandering across the face of the earth about restructuring. And I never liked it because it sounded like simply a bunch of administrative decisions. Francis says that not simply our hearts have to be aligned with the mission of the church, but our structures and our strategies as well. And so I think that, for those of us who do what you are doing and are glimpsing something new, the question then is, what will be the new wineskin that is needed to hold this new wine? Now, if I could give you an answer for that, I would be almost as rich as Donna would be if I paid her for every time that I cited her conference. But yeah, I think that, administration is a gift, but it's in service of the mission. And part of administration now is to discern what needs to be changed in order to serve that. Yes, please. Samantha, you are my guide, so you can. And does everyone know it's Samantha's birthday? So, be my guest.
Hi, it's my birthday. My name is Samantha. I'm a Lay Center Leadership Scholar, currently studying at the Gregoriana, so I'm really grateful to be here. And my question is, when I talk to young people my age, both those who were Catholic and then left the church or people who never had any religious background, a lot of the time they speak from a lot of pain. There's a lot of pain at the mistakes that the church has frankly made, especially about the child abuse crisis and the way that they minister to the other, whether that's someone of a different sexual orientation or someone of a different religion. So I don't know how to talk to my peers when they have this pain that's very legitimate. How do I talk to them and not run over that, but still acknowledge the beauty within, not just within, yes, Christianity, but also the church that still remains despite what it's caused? I don't know how to balance that in some way.
Well, I get a number of people some young, some not so young, that tell me they're leaving the church. And some people actually want a formal declaration that I recognize that. If I get a chance to talk with them, what I like to ask very gently is, what do you think you're leaving? It's not the Elks, you know, or the Knights of Columbus, or even a fraternity or sorority. I mean, it's the body of Christ. It's the place where I hear the word and I receive the sacraments that give me life. And I say, I wouldn't let anyone take that away from me. There's no way, I think, to sugarcoat, you know, some of the terrible things that have happened. But, you know, there's a lot of terrible things that are done in the name of love. But I still believe it's possible to love, and to love authentically. There are lots of spots on the bride of Christ, but there's a beauty there too, and I think it's to try and deal with that sort of absolutism, that, you know, because my trust has been betrayed so grievously, and it is, I mean, it's awful, the betrayal of trust. But I think it's also true that we've been unsuccessful, even with people who've not left the church, with really conveying the beauty that's there. You know, Benedict XVI liked to say that the way for postmodern women and men to God is beauty. So if there are any artists in here and musicians and poets, continue to do what you're doing, because you're leading us to God. But there's a beauty about the church that I think has to be part of that outreach to young people, and say, you know, and that we who have a pastoral responsibility in the church have to try and reduce those stumbling blocks, you know, and you know, I love the zeal of Paul in First Corinthians, where, you know, he's discussing some of the stumbling blocks in that community. And he says, I know that eating meat that's been sacrificed to idols is not a sin, but I don't do it for fear of making my weaker brother or sister fall. So I think that we as pastors have to be able to point out the things that we don't do, even if they're not necessarily sinful, but because they make people fall. And that, I think, sort of a cold, how would you say, nominalistic ethic makes people fall. The greatest fear, as I said, this recent survey that I saw about young people regarding the church, is that it judges them. Now, I think we can correct that, but we're going to need help. And I also think that, you know, when I think about the rate of young women who are leaving the church, if there's ever a case for mentoring, it's that. It's women who have stayed with the church, not without pain and not without cost, but they're still here. They can make a much more convincing case than I ever can. And so I think grab one of these fine women here later and say, why? Why did you stay? And I think they'll be able to speak to it. Good.
We'd love to open it up for other questions, and maybe because we're trying to record the richness of this conversation, if you would share your question, and Cardinal Tobin, if you might repeat the question, and then we can get it recorded, and then we can answer it. So are there any other questions? Yes.
Okay, so I've been thinking, I'm also an ECHO, so I'm currently an ECHO. I'm not yet quite a grad like Colleen and Jonathan over there, but I'm placed in Salt Lake City. I think as a young woman in the church, part of my struggle has always been trying to relate to clergy in a certain way. I have two older brothers, and I think all three of us throughout our lives have sought out mentors in the clergy. And we've all talked about that experience. Both my brothers had mentors who are priests, and I've had some really wonderful mentors who are members of the clergy. I think some of the best mentors I've had have been women in the church, both lay and religious. But there have been a lot of points in my life where I've really struggled to relate to clergy in the church, just because they chose not to want to have that relationship or even intentionally distance themselves. So I guess I'm thinking about the role of young women in the church in terms of trying to relate to members of the clergy. How do we bridge that gap, especially like starting with seminary and I guess continuing into like full-on members of the clergy? Like, I don't know quite how to term this, but I guess I think there's a gap there that we need to do something about. How do we do that?
You tell me if I got the question. The question, as I heard it, is how can you prepare clergy
To relate well to women.
to relate well with women?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I can give you one solution, but I don't think it works for everybody. And that's have 8 sisters. That's what I have, you know. I could show you the scars, you know. That's what I said. But I often ask them, you know, I say, you know, because they're all done very well in their careers, and they almost all of them have families. And I said, what keeps you in? And they say it's their home, you know, it's where they belong. They use a lot of metaphors for it. And I know some of them, I think, have had good relationship with clergy. Some of them are, you know, very close friends of some of my classmates, you know, and I can talk with them. I do think that when the church thinks about forming priests, there are 4 pillars, they say, of the formation process. The human formation, the academic formation, the intellectual formation, the pastoral formation, and the spiritual formation. And we're still struggling to get the first one right, the human formation. You know, and how one, you know, lives, prepares for a celibate lifestyle, and still being able to relate warmly with men and women. And once again, I don't think this works for everybody, but the first time I was named a superior in my order, I was a local superior of a community of 20, of which I was the youngest member. The priest who baptized me was in the community. But one of the older priests was really angry with me one day, and he said, Tobin, somewhere in the world today there's a woman completely happy. And she doesn't know why. So I asked him. But I think it is in the human piece, and it's in combating the evil that Francis talks about so often of clericalism. That, you know, somehow we're cast apart and demanding a certain distance and, you know, even subservience of others. No, that isn't what it's about. You know. So I think a lot of us are aware of it. I watch for it in my own seminarians. And I think, though, the really good news that you conveyed is you found some guides, and they were women. How wonderful. How wonderful. God is good.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question. So do we have one more question from the floor? Okay, Laura.
Actually, it's 2 questions, but they're brief. The first is, you talked about how we can accompany young people in spiritual discernment and help them discern the Spirit. So many lay people aren't formed in that. That's something that a lot of religious and priests have in terms of formation, and a lot of lay people lack that. So how can lay people accompany young people in a more practical way, because we don't have those skills per se? And then the other question, I guess it's a little similar to what Samantha mentioned, but I guess how do we accompany young people who had an experience of mentoring gone wrong? Because they either got involved with a community, a well-intentioned congregation, but that was in some way misled and that really injured them spiritually. How can we reach out to these injured young people and mentor them back to spiritual health?
Well, the first question about the equipping, and I agree, spiritual direction is a pastoral service and it requires formation. Well, I think then, the local church has to, and when possible, religious orders offer that service. Now, I can testify that the moat is the mother of all Tobins. My dad, she was widowed at a very young age, and she really worked hard, so all 13 of us would, have a chance to flourish. And we did because of her. But she found out about 10 years after Dad died that there was a death benefit in her because Dad was a disabled veteran. And it was for the further education of the surviving spouse. Well, she had a master's degree and had been a teacher, so she wasn't really interested in going to that type of academic program. But she found out that the Jesuits in Michigan were offering a 2-year program for lay people to teach them spiritual formation, both the sort of intellectual content, but also the experiential, and of course being directed themselves all the time. So she did, and she did her 2 years, and afterwards didn't hang out a shingle or anything, but people came to her. And even a couple of religious communities that had novitiates not too far away would send a novice over to talk with her. Now, in case you think that just happens in Michigan, in my last archdiocese in Indianapolis, there were 2 possibilities. There was one program that was sponsored by the archdiocese, and one by a very fine monastery of Benedictine nuns within the city. And directors were being trained all through there. It was a start. I've not found anything yet in Newark, but I'm looking, and so I think providing those experiences is part of the pastoral conversion that the church should undergo with the understanding of its mission today. The other one's a very difficult question about how do you restore, really what you're asking is how do you restore the trust? Because the relationship of a spiritual director or a group, if it betrays that trust or the recipient feels betrayed, it's very difficult to come back. And I suspect the best we can do is help people look for the faithfulness of God and work with them on that. And if they can, we have so many examples these days of very vulnerable people whose trust has been betrayed. And it's awful. It's the nuclear explosion in a person's life. So that's about the best I can do, but I think I know the devastation. I don't always have the skills to help people out from it.
Okay. Thank you, Cardinal Tobin. Thank you so much. Thank you.